Thank you, Adi, for the invitation and the introduction. Hello again, or hello to those who weren't here. I will tell you a story today that focuses on diversity of brains, but this time not so much on the look at how many different ways there are to build a brain, but actually on the what does it matter how exactly a brain is built. And it's a story that, of course, we would like to it's a story in which we would like to hear something about our own brain. How does our brain compare to others? How did our own brain come to be? And what defines our brain, something that you hear often is that, well, ours is the most complex of them all. Ours is, our brain is, some people like to even say, it's the most complex system in the whole universe. I don't know about that, but we can certainly talk about complexity. And my favorite definition of complexity is a simplified version of what you find in physics. Complexity is the amount of information that defines a system. So, and that's particularly nice for biology because it can be used as both before the fact or after the fact. You can refer to it as the amount of information that defines a system as it is built, as it becomes shaped. Or you could also use that. You could also look at the finished, let's say, adult brain, and say that complexity is the amount of information that you can then use to describe that brain. So here we have three houses. So in qualitatively, they're the same object, but I think you agree with me that one of them is much, much more complex than the other two. And you see that complexity certainly has to do with the number of elements that build each of these houses. So having more elements does not necessarily mean that you will get a more complex house. Remember, you could build a very large version of that first very simple house. It would be very large, but it would still be fairly simple, much simpler than another one. So one of the main questions here is, how do you get a super complex human brain, assuming that that's really the case? Where does that complexity come from, and how does it matter? Well, part of the how you get this super complex human brain is known from the fossil record. We know that compared to the evolution of all other mammalian species, which, so if we, at this graph you're looking at the size of the brain and how it varies over time up to, this is now, and this is going back in the past. So if we were to continue this line, looking at the largest brain of let's just stick to primates here, you would go back to 55 million years ago, and you would start with a very small primate brain, and very slowly over time you would see that the largest primate brain at any time is always a bit larger than it previously was, but it's really only about 2 million years ago or so that you see in any type of mammal, you see this extraordinarily fast and extraordinarily large increase in the size of the skull, which in this case we know is enough to indicate that you have a similar increase in the size of the brain, in this case actually a tripling in the size of the brain. So we know from the fossil record that the brain of our ancestors became 3 times its size in just 2 million years, which certainly seems extraordinary compared to other species. So that's one big question. How did that happen? And also, how come in our species alone? Those are questions that accompany a number of other features that our species thought for a very long time that were unique to us. Things like making tools or using tools or having symbolic, using symbols to represent ideas or features. And the more people have actually turned their attention to other animals and actually investigated how much do other species actually do, how much can they actually do if they have the opportunity, the more they have realized that actually humans are not alone in most, if not all, of the capabilities that we have. And that word is very important, capabilities, not abilities. I'll come back to that in a little bit. But first, let me just show you one example of something that other animals can do once they're given the same opportunities that we have. What you're going to see is the monitor of a computer and the chimpanzee Ayumu, who is interacting with that monitor as she plays a video game. The video game is something that you've probably played yourself. You're going to see numbers from 1 to 9 appear on the screen. And the numbers get covered by the white squares. And Ayumu's task, for which she gets rewarded with food, is to touch the squares in the same order of the ascending orders of the numbers underneath. Just look at that and ask yourself, could you do it as fast and as well as Ayumu does? She does it quickly, presses that circle so she gets another trial. With each success, she gets rewarded a piece of fruit. She can choose to play this video game whenever she wants, as many times as she wants. She's free. She lives in a very large enclosure. She has free access to the video game. She plays whenever she wants. She learned it just the way that we learn to play Mario Galaxy, for instance, where there are no written manuals, no written rules. You just sit there and start interacting with the thing, and you learn what you do. She got so good at it that the authors of the original study couldn't help themselves but say she actually performs much better than the college graduate, the college students that we compared. Which is really amazing, because that means that at the very least, Ayumu was capable of learning that these little doodles on the screen have some kind of hierarchical meaning, and she has the visual memory ability to remember where they were. She has the spatial location ability, and she is certainly capable of taking in all of that information and creating an abstract plan that she can then work with. Well, thankfully, those two other researchers 2 years later published another study in which they they a bit insulted by it or not, they took it to heart, and they thought that, well, that's not a fair comparison. College students have many other things to do with their time. So, and Ayumu can play as much video game as she wants. So let's make it fair, and let's give college students as much opportunity, as many hours of practice as Ayumu had, and then we'll compare them. And what they realized there then was that, yes, humans can actually perform as well as chimpanzees given similar opportunities and given similar time, which I think is a lovely twist to how we usually don't expect them to do as well as we do. Now, what could be this quantitative difference across species? How come the human brain becoming larger so fast and so much in evolution actually have anything to do with our cognitive capabilities? That becomes particularly problematic to think that there's something about the size of the brain that's really important. First, because our brain is not the largest one around it. I'll come to that in just a little bit. The second is that the underlying expectation for a very long time was that a brain is a brain is a brain. So if you take a larger brain and compare it to a smaller one, the larger brain should always have more neurons than the smaller one. And if you take two brains like these of the same size, similar, very respectable 400 grams, you would expect these two brains, especially their cerebral cortices, to be made of similar numbers of neurons, and therefore the owners of these two brains should have similar cognitive abilities. And yet you realize that one belongs to a chimp and can play video games like I just showed you, and the other belongs to a cow. And to be perfectly fair, we don't know if cows could play video games if we ever gave them enough time and something that they can interact with their noses, for instance. But for now, we do have some, let's call it anecdotal evidence that the behavioral repertoire of chimpanzees certainly seems to be much richer and more complex and more flexible than the behavioral repertoire of cows. But again, we won't really know until somebody really tries to teach a cow to play video games. So the next question then is, do we actually know that these two brains are made of similar numbers of neurons? Because a much simpler answer to this presumed discrepancy in cognitive capabilities between cows and chimpanzees, even though they have similar brain or cortical sizes, is that, well, maybe the chimp actually has many more neurons in the cortex than the cow. How do we find out? Well, to do that, I developed about 15 years ago a very simple low-tech method called turning brains into soup, really. That's what it is. You start with a fixed brain that you've collected from an animal after its death. You separate it into as many parts as you want. You can count anything that you can dissect, any part of the brain or any other organ. Then you take that part of the brain, let's say the cortex, and you slice it down into smaller pieces. So really like dicing what you're cooking, you crush it and turn it into a soup. And when you do that, you're dissolving the membranes of all of the cells, so you're releasing the nuclei of each cell into this soup, into the suspension. And that's very helpful because once the nuclei are free floating in that suspension, you can just shake that suspension and make the nuclei become evenly distributed in the suspension, even though in the original tissue they were highly unevenly distributed, just like people are concentrated in only a few cities in a country. And once you have them stained and visible like this under the microscope, it's just a matter of 10 minutes until you count all the nuclei, and assuming that every cell has one and only one nucleus, counting nuclei is actually the same thing as counting cells. So we use a marker to then tell, in an extra 2-hour step, to tell how many of these nuclei were actually neurons, and that's what I will be showing you. So I'll focus on the cortex now for the rest of my talk, because this is the part of the brain that, even though it's technically not required for behavior, it is the part that receives a copy of every single bit of information that the other structures of the brain receive, and it has the circuitry that allows it to combine all that information, to put it all together, to create new associations, to find patterns, to actually, to find patterns and to create records of those patterns, so you actually gain a past and a future beyond your simple present, which is what all the rest of your brain will give you. So there's good reason then to expect that the more neurons a species has in the cerebral cortex, or the equivalent part of the brain that's organized in this way, the more capability it's going to have to process information and to behave in flexible and complex ways. All right, next question then. How many neurons in the human brain? We found an average of 86 billion. That's, I like to say, It's the average of 4 Brazilian males aged either 50 or 70 years old, but still that's the number that we have, not 100 billion, certainly not 10 times as many non-neuronal cells. And even though the cortex is this large percentage of the size of the mass of the brain, it's 82% of the mass of the entire human brain, it actually only has about 20% of all its neurons. And that number is very important, the about 20%, because it's exactly the same thing that we find in almost every single other mammal that we've looked at so far, regardless of the size of the cortex, absolute or relative size. There's always about only 20%, 15 to 25% of all brain neurons are situated in the cerebral cortex. The majority of them are in the cerebellum, about 4 neurons in the cerebellum to every neuron that you have in the cerebral cortex, no matter what, no matter the species. Unless you're an elephant, and then we should be talking about how come the elephant is an outlier and not why humans are outliers. So you see that the rest of the brain actually has proportionately very small number of neurons. So good. We know how many neurons a human brain and a human cortex has, so what? Those numbers are only really going to mean something if we have other numbers to compare to from other species. So we have that data by now. We've been collecting those data over just over a decade. And I'm going to show you a few graphs here and there, and when you see them, you see that primates always shown in red, rodents always shown in green, and then the other species, the other types of mammals in different colors, but we have a large variety of them. So when we compare numbers of neurons in the cortex across species, what do we find? Well, one of the things that we find is that 2 brains of a similar size don't necessarily have similar numbers of neurons in the cortex. This is the giraffe, and you see its cortex has an indicated 1.7 billion neurons, but the macaque, that is actually so small you may not notice it on its back, in its much smaller cortex, it has just as many neurons, 1.6 in this particular case. You can also find that cases where the smaller brain actually has many more neurons than an even larger brain. So something that we found is that even though the elephant brain is 3 times the size of the human brain, and its cortex is twice the size of a human cortex, the elephant cortex has only about 1/3 as many neurons as our much smaller half-sized cortex has. Now, you could also think, well, there you have it. This is what's special about humans. We have a much larger number of cortical neurons than you would expect from any other animal. Again, apples and oranges, you have to make sure that you're comparing humans to other primates to say that. And in that case, what you find is that, yes, humans do have the most neurons in the cerebral cortex, but we fit exactly along the line formed by the triangles here that that describes how large the cerebral cortex of a primate is, depending on how many neurons it has. You see that it is possible to find in nature many other cortices that are even larger than the human cortex. Whales, for instance, are predicted to all be around here. Here's the elephant. But the only way a cortex can have tons of neurons, can have, let's say, more than 1 billion neurons, is if it's either very large, it belongs to a very large animal, and that will be important, really important in just a little bit, or else it belongs to a primate. So there's something about primate brains that allows many more neurons to fit. And I love to think, of course, that Darwin, who first said that the human brain really is just a scaled up primate brain. with not a whole lot of reason. There was not a whole lot of data available then, but that was a necessary implication of all that he thought about evolution. So it turns out that we can actually say that Darwin himself had a brain made in the image of other primate brains. What is so particular about primate brains is that, especially in its cortex, as the animal gains neurons in its cortex in evolution, the cortical neurons in a primate, they don't become much larger, whereas in everybody else, in all other mammals, more neurons also become larger neurons. So it's a much more inflationary way, let's say, of adding neurons to the cortex. The cortex becomes very large, very fast, unless you are a primate. Or actually, unless you're a bird, especially a songbird or a parrot. And in that case, what you find is that these animals have been diversifying their brains in terms of size, adding neurons to their brains over evolutionary time, but without any real apparent change in the average size of their neurons. The consequence is that if you take 3 brains of a similar, or 3 cortices of a similar size, the bird cortex will have many more neurons than the primate, which in turn will have many more neurons than the non-primate mammal. So that is illustrated for mammals here. You see that, so each species here, each dot is one species. Primates are in red, and this is us humans. And you see that our cortex has just the mass that you would expect for its number of neurons, or vice versa. And if you pull a horizontal line here, you see that any primate has more cortical neurons than other mammals with a similar cortical size. And that is, like I said, a consequence of the density of the neurons, so the inverse of size of the neurons, remaining fairly stable across primate species in evolution, whereas if you're not a primate, like the original, the first mammals ever, like they were not primates, the more neurons you have in your cortex, the bigger the average neuron becomes. Now, even though we can't go back in time and say something about those first mammals, we know from the fossil record that they were tiny little creatures with tiny brains and therefore tiny cortices with very few neurons. And because this relationship here applies to everybody alive who is a mammal but not a primate, we can infer that this is also the relationship that applied to the first mammals. So we can infer that the first mammals were tiny little creatures with tiny little neurons, and we'll come back to what that means. Why should we care about that in just a little bit. For now, let me just I'll open a parenthesis here about what difference does it make if you have a primate or a non-primate cortex, or more generally, what difference does it make if you have more or fewer neurons in a cortex of a given size? Shouldn't just the size of the cortex or the size of the brain matter? Well, looking at a range of carnivorous species, we found that dogs have, on average, twice as many neurons as you find in the cortex of a cat. There are many ways of looking at this. If you're a cat lover, you can send me hate mail. If you're a dog lover, you can say, "Ha! I always knew it." If you're a cautious scientist, you could say, "Show me more data, show me more numbers, and show me numbers that actually measure their behavioral capabilities or performance." So let me show you a few more numbers. With a brain that is actually smaller than even a cat brain, the blue macaw actually has even more neurons in the cortex than you find in cat, dog, and actually even a macaque that, remember, had 1.6 billion. So like I told you, if you take 3 animals of a similar size, so if you want to be consistent about this, you find that the bird always has more neurons in its version of the cortex than a primate, which in turn has many more neurons than the non-primate. And that for a similar body mass. And those are differences that you would not suspect from just looking at the size of the brain and how it compares to the size of the body. Do we have data on cognitive performance? Is there anything that we can relate to these numbers of neurons and see if there's any good correlation there? We actually do. There's a growing body of data that started with applying the same simple tests to a very large number of species involving labs in different parts of the globe. And initially relating that performance, and so in this case, the ability to exert self-control in a decision-making choice, and relating that to cranial capacity. And you see that the larger the brain, the better the primates perform. There's something there for birds as well, but you see that corvids perform at ceiling level. They perform at 100% success, even though they have much smaller brains than the great apes. Now, when instead of using the size of the brain, you use the number of neurons that these creatures have in their cortex or equivalent, then you find that birds and primates actually come together, and they have similar levels of performance to similar numbers of, or at least a similar range of numbers of neurons. So there's much better agreement than you would suspect from simply looking at the size of the brain. Which means, by the way, that calling someone a bird brain is really not an insult. If it's a songbird or a parrot, it's actually a very high compliment. All right, so it looks like having more neurons increases your cognitive capabilities, so that should be advantageous in evolution. That should be advantageous in everyday life. You could then ask the question, why doesn't everybody? Why did that very rapid increase in numbers of cortical neurons only happen to our species? It certainly happened a little bit to others, but not nearly as much. Well, one possibility is that there are downsides to having more neurons. There are essentially, in biology, 2 main downsides, 2 main disadvantages possible. There are those that relate to energy and those that relate to time. And I'll argue in just a little bit that actually even those that relate to energy are actually time-related disadvantages. But let's start with just looking at energy. Does it cost more energy to have more neurons in your cortex? And the answer is yes. We don't yet have the large amount of the large body of data that we would like to have, but there is enough in the literature measuring how much glucose, so how much energy the brain of different animals costs per minute, that we can compare to our data. And here we find that it doesn't matter if you look at a mouse, a rat, a squirrel, a monkey, a baboon, or a human, you find that all the data points line up perfectly in a linear relationship. That means that the more the neurons you have in the cortex, the more the energy that cortex, in this case, that the whole brain costs, at an average of about 6 kilocalories per billion neurons per day. Now, you see that the human brain is not an outlier at all in how much energy it costs. That probably clashes with what you've heard about how much energy the human brain costs, which is a lot relative to the size of our body. So the math there is that even though the human brain is only about 2% of the size of your whole body, it uses between 20 and 25% of all the energy that powers your body. How can that be true at the same time as what I'm just showing you, that the human brain actually costs just as much energy as you would expect for its number of neurons? Well, it's because we are primates, and primates that we are, we have many more neurons in the cortex for a similar body size, like I showed you before. So our brain costs exactly as much as you could expect for its number of neurons for a primate, and actually for the size of its body also for a primate. It's just relatively more expensive compared to a non-primate. So why does the human brain cost so much energy? It's simply because it has an enormous number of neurons. So we can go back here and add that there is a downside to adding more neurons. It is that it comes with a higher energetic cost. So if lots of neurons require lots of energy, and lots of energy require lots of time eating, because we're talking about animals, we don't do photosynthesis, so we have to eat to get the energy that runs our bodies. That means that the more neurons a mammal has in its body, the more energy it's going to have to eat, and more likely the more time it's going to have to spend eating. Now, think of a mouse and an elephant eating. The elephant's mouth is much, much bigger, so per unit time, an elephant can eat much more than a mouse. So right there, you already realize that there's an advantage to becoming bigger. On the other hand, the only way you can be an elephant, even with an elephant-sized mouth, is if you have about 18 to 19 hours per day that you can dedicate to eating. Because of the food that you eat, it yields so few calories that either you eat 18 or 19 hours per day, or you're not going to be an elephant. Not for much longer. So the question then becomes, how could an animal like an elephant even appear in evolution? Especially since we know that the first mammals were tiny little creatures with tiny little brains and tiny little mouths. How do you go from there to large creatures? The logic to me was that, well, not only we have a limited number of hours in the day, there's 24 of them, mammals that we are, there's an even more restricted number of hours available to eat because we sleep a good part of the day. So the only way an animal can eat 18 hours per day, we could not, by the way, is if it has a brain that allows it to, that can support, that can tolerate, can function with being awake for most of the day. What do we know about how much different animals sleep? What do we know about the evolution of sleep? And again, absent a time machine, the only way we can even start inferring things about how much sleep for the first mammals did per day is to find something today that correlates with that amount of sleep, and then try to relate that back to what we know were these tiny little first mammals. Well, we do know that there are animals that sleep as little as 2 or 3 hours per day, giraffes, elephants. We do know that there are animals that sleep as much as 19 hours per day, several bats, several tiny little shrews. So from what I said before, that alone would make sense. You can only be a large animal if you sleep very little, but if you're tiny, you could afford to spend most of your day asleep. The middle of the field gets really muddled because you have animals that are, you have primates and carnivorans that are about the same size, and yet one sleeps most of the day, the other doesn't really. But this is what people have been arguing, that overall there is a reasonable correlation between the size of the body and how many hours per day each species sleeps. And again, you could make an evolutionary, meaning an adaptive argument about this, arguing simply that less sleep is something that becomes selected for, as animals become larger. Either they sleep less, or the whole thing is just not going to work, right? But it could also be the other way around. And the other way around is that less sleep is something that comes naturally with getting a larger brain or getting more neurons in the cortex. Why would I ever think that? Because a few years ago, there was this really, really cool study that came out of Mike and Nidegard's lab in Denmark, where they found that while the mouse is awake doing stuff under the microscope, its brain is washed by CSF, it's washed by fluid, and that happens naturally, but only the surface is skimmed. And that means that while the animal is awake, there's a number of toxins, metabolites, including sleep-inducing metabolites, that are produced and accumulate within the tissue because only the surface is being washed. But as soon as the animal falls asleep under the microscope, and that happens quite often, they realize that now all that liquid just gushes through. It gushes into the tissue. And effectively, you have the entire volume of the brain now washed by that CSF. In practice, what this means is that when the animal falls asleep, all the toxins, all the sleep-inducing metabolites that had accumulated during waking get washed away. So sleep is a period of clearance of metabolites that accumulate during waking. So you could think then of what should be the factors that determine how long it takes for enough sleep-inducing metabolites to accumulate in a cortex, depending on its size, depending on how it's made of, depending on how many neurons it has. So what I figured was that the rate of accumulation of sleep-inducing metabolites, which should determine how long until an animal inevitably falls asleep and stays asleep until everything is cleared away, it should depend on the density of neurons that are producing sleep-inducing metabolites. But not only that, it should also depend on the surface, the ratio of surface area that still gets cleaned off even while the animal is awake. So the higher the density of neurons, the more rapidly the animal should fall asleep, but the smaller the surface area, also the more rapidly the animal should fall asleep. First question is, does that correlate with daily sleep? The answer is yes, it does, and actually very nicely and much better than the size of the body. The next question is, how does that relate to the number of neurons in the cortex? And what we have is this relationship here. So the more neurons you have in the cortex, the lower that ratio of neuronal density per area becomes. And because of how that correlates with the number of hours of spent asleep, we can then add these numbers to this graph that I showed you before, where we can predict that the very first mammals that were very tiny, with tiny little neurons in a tiny little cortex, they must have been over here. The first mammal, we can predict that the first mammals spent most of their day asleep. But then what happens is that as soon as a version appears that has more neurons, because of how neurons are added, they become larger, the density drops, and the surface increases very rapidly. That concentration of neurons per surface area decreases, which means that this new animal with a bit more neurons in the cortex can actually sleep a little bit less. If it sleeps a little bit less, it can actually spend a little bit more time per day feeding, which means that it can now afford a slightly bigger body size, which is also helpful because with a larger body comes a larger mouth, which helps get you more energy and therefore support even more neurons. And the difference to primates is that when primates appear, it's with that separation between more neurons no longer becoming larger neurons. So when primates appear, you get more neurons, but you don't really get these benefits of having more time. But it's okay, because when primates first appeared, it was at a point when the cortex presumably allowed something like 9 or 10 hours of sleep per day. No longer 18, no longer 15, something that still allowed a reasonably large brain and body. Question is, how much larger? So you can do the math, and I'll show you that in just a second, but let me show you the result first. We can calculate that if we had to eat, if we ate like any other primate out there does, given our limitation, which is still just as you would expect for a primate, of sleeping about 8 hours per day, we would have to spend 9.5 hours per day every single day out there looking for food and eating. You're at a university. Think of how different your day would be like if you had to dedicate this many hours to just keeping yourself fed and therefore alive. How much could you actually learn about the world, or even afford the luxury to ask about the world and about yourself? That's one thing, but well, you could and should ask me for the hard numbers, where's the actual math. And this is how we did it. What we reasoned was that the amount of energy that an animal takes in from its diet, if that animal stays alive over time and it's not losing weight and it's also not getting fat over time, then that amount of energy must be equivalent to how much energy it costs to operate a body of a certain size, which is something that we can estimate from a well-known biochemical relationship. And we can also add it to the cost of running a brain with a certain number of neurons, which we can also estimate now that we know that on average it costs 6 kilocalories per billion neurons in the brain per day. So you can make that an inequality now and say that the only animals that would be viable are the ones that eat enough to afford both a body of a certain size and a certain number of neurons. If we do that, we can calculate what is the maximal number of neurons that a primate that ate a certain number of days could have. And if it's a 25 kilogram primate, we can calculate that that 25 kilogram primate would at most, eating 8 hours per day, it would at most afford 53 billion neurons. For a primate eating the same way, 8 hours per day, for that primate to become any bigger, it would have to give up numbers of neurons in the brain. It can become bigger, but if nothing else changes, it's going to have to give up neurons in the brain until it reaches a point where it's just not viable anymore. Orangutans and gorillas fall in that range over there, about 75 kilograms and about 30 billion neurons in the brain as a whole. There are some gorillas that become bigger than that, and that is at the cost of forcing other animals to give them food. Either they do that or they're not viable. Speaking of non-viable, there's no way that eating like other primates do, our species could afford that enormous increase in number of neurons that we have. Actually, our body mass is somewhere around here. You see that eating 8 hours per day, any increase already above half as many neurons as we have in the brain would already be close to being unviable. And yet, here we are. So obviously our ancestors found some way. Now, I showed you already that the human brain actually costs as much energy as you could expect, not less. It never became cheaper. I didn't show you, but actually I did. The human body costs about as much energy as you could also predict. And we don't we certainly don't spend 9.5 hours per day eating. So what happened? What allowed this enormous number of neurons that our brain alone has concentrated so much in the cerebral cortex? In one word, it was that. And that is technology. Technology that arises as you have enough neurons in your cerebral cortex that can associate information, start creating a record of your past experiences, make predictions for the future, and start manipulating the future. Technology is, this is, again, I love definitions, this is my favorite definition, is any object, process, method, or even knowledge whose application helps solve a problem faster. And by virtue of solving that problem and making it, getting there faster, it allows you to tackle new problems. And what exactly does this type of technology give you? So I'm talking about stone tools, of course, the very first type of technology that we know of, developed by our ancestors. We think of stone tools as objects to cut and kill animals, but stone tools actually are cooking implements. One of the many of the functions that they serve have to do with processing the food before you put it in your mouth, which is really important because once you crush and cut and pulp your food, you spend much less time and much less effort chewing it in your mouth. Which is absolutely necessary to produce saliva and mix the food with enough saliva that you can even swallow it. You can try this at home with a glass of water nearby, please. Try to swallow something before it's completely chewed up and moist. You just cannot swallow it. So swallowing so chewing is really important. And when your food reaches your mouth already in a pre-processed manner, then you have an advantage of time. You gain a much bigger time advantage if you use a different type of technology that we know that our ancestors, so stone tools appeared about 4 million years ago. We know that our ancestors somewhere around 1.5 million years ago developed another type of cooking technology, and that was controlled use of fire. Fire works beautifully, not only in breaking down food, making it softer and easier to eat, chew, and swallow. It also makes it much more palatable. Different species also prefer cooked food to raw foods. And more importantly, it allows you that amazing thing of being able to eat much more in the same amount of time, or actually even less time. It allows you to get even more calories from the same food. It increases the yield of the caloric yield of raw foods from 30% to 100% in cooked foods. And why is that so important? Because it gives you free time. So remember that if you don't have the means to buy more time, having more neurons in your brain is a liability, but as soon as that is no longer a limitation, then you could actually simply enjoy the benefits of having more neurons in your brain, in particular in your cortex, and that's what I've proposed, that there's a fairly simple explanation for how come the sudden and very large increase in the size of the brain in human evolution, and that is technology, cooking technologies. First just stone tools, then fire, and that allowed us to go from first being limited to eating just raw foods that we picked to actually having a culture, and then agriculture, building societies, communities with distribution of labor. With distribution of labor, you have distribution of food and energy and different modes of life until eventually you get to the point where you can develop electricity, which allows you to now keep all the calories that you want and need stocked in your own home, or if not that, you can just walk 10 minutes down the street and get all the calories that you need in your favorite fast food joint, which allows you actually to not only get as much energy as you need, but actually overdo it, which brings us back full circle to raw foods, which are the once were the problem and now are the cure. So we come back then to the story. Yes, there is a high energetic cost, but because more neurons apparently come with more waking hours, that cost is taken care of. You could say that there's a larger body that's required to feed that larger, to even house that larger brain, but because a larger body is also allowed when you sleep less and eat more, that should also be taken care of. Now, you could argue then, okay, maybe it's something else. Maybe it takes a much longer time to develop and mature a cortex that has more neurons, or a brain that has more neurons. Now, there's two possible reasons for that. One is that a larger body takes longer to grow. Another one is simply that maybe a larger brain has more parts and therefore takes longer to assemble. So you could ask, is life history, is the time that it takes an animal to develop to adulthood, is that related to the size of the body, or is that related to the size of the brain? Now, the interesting thing is that people jump to the option, it must be the size of the body. And I agree that intuitively it makes sense. The larger a body is, the longer it should take it to grow. I think if we were still farmers, we would not believe that. Growing up with horses and cows should remind everyone that these animals grow really, really fast. The kinds of animals that we have growing with ourselves is cats and dogs. So I'll give you the example of my dog. This is Archibald at age 3 months. And this is Archibald at age 9 months. So it only took him 6 months to grow all that much. And in under 1 year, he's already as large as I am. Whereas it took me 16 years to grow as much. So it's clearly not the size of the body that puts a requirement, or that forces the time of your life history to vary. What is it then? Well, here comes, I got really lucky that I found a very nice, large, and nicely organized database on life history organized by other researchers. And here you see two aspects of life history: the maximal longevity of a warm-blooded species and how long it takes that species to reach female maturity. And you see that humans are sort of in there. And you see that the longer it takes a species to reach puberty, the longer it also can live, the maximal time. How could this possibly be related to the size of the body, or to the size or to your brain? Well, there's a good relationship between the rate at which the warm body, the body of a warm-blooded animal uses energy, and how long it lives. So you see that the lower the metabolic rate, so the more slowly a warm-blooded animal uses energy, the more it tends to live. It's not a perfect relationship, but it's a very significant and pretty obvious relationship. Okay. Now, measuring specific metabolic rate is not very straightforward, but we know that it is a very good function of body mass. The bigger the size of an animal, the more slowly it uses energy. That means that you can expect that the bigger an animal is, the more slowly it uses energy, and therefore, the longer it can live. And here you have, again, a correlation that's not perfect, but it's very clear and significant and positive. So the bigger an animal is, the longer it tends to live if it's warm-blooded. presumably because its metabolic rate is slower and it accumulates damages more slowly. Now the thing is, this is considering all warm-blooded animals together. If you color code the data, you realize that for a similar body mass, birds live much longer than primates, which in turn live much longer than any other mammal. Does this sound familiar to you? It's the same thing, the same graph that I showed you before, where for a similar body mass, birds have many more neurons in the cortex than primates, which also have many more neurons than other animals, than other mammals. So if you now look at the two things directly, what you realize is that a much better predictor, much better predictor of both time to reach sexual maturity and how long a warm-blooded species lives after reaching sexual maturity is simply how many neurons it has in its cortex. And you see that red dot over there? That is our species. Humans, again, are no exception. So if you put that in the context of human evolution, we can add one more piece to the story, and that is that as the number of neurons increased, courtesy of technology, or certainly with some kind of contribution from technology, we can actually also predict that the length of childhood also increased, not because of something special or selected for or outstanding in humans, but simply as a consequence of whatever it is that puts more neurons in cortex. And together with that, longevity also increased. Now, an increase in longevity is particularly important when you're considering a species that dies very early and that has a very large number of neurons that could hold all that information in the cortex. Why is that important? Because that's the remaining piece of the puzzle. There's plenty of information in the genes to put the basic scaffold of a brain together, but that would be not much more than having a pile of Legos that you can separate by color or by size, perhaps. To get to an adult brain, you need much more information. You need that system to take in much more information that will actually shape that system, that will actively shape those connections. So the notion here is that the more pieces you have in a network, the more information it's going to require to actually reach that steady state, and the longer it should take to be shaped by information. And that happens through self-organization, and we know that that's a biological property of living tissues. It's not a feature of the human brain exclusively. It's a feature of any brain, that they start out life as this massive bucket of Legos or a massive block of stone that isn't anything yet, but as it absorbs information, it can certainly become something as that information starts shaping the system and gets written into the exact conformation of that network. And that is how our biological capabilities, what our cortex is and what it's made of, get turned into abilities. And with these abilities, and especially with more time, come the technologies that we can develop. If I can recommend you one TED Talk to watch, please watch this one. It's Hans Rosling explaining why he thinks that the washing machine is the most extraordinary piece of technology in modern years. And the reason is exactly that it's a piece of technology that frees time that decades ago women could then dedicate to learning, to educating themselves, to participating in the education of their young, and therefore favoring cultural transmission. So let me put it all together and show you my ridiculously simplified version of animal evolution, mammal evolution, and human evolution. In the beginning, there was a tiny little brain. which had very few neurons in the cortex and had a certain set of biological capabilities that it could use and develop into its own a certain set of abilities that were maybe not much, but it was okay. It fared fairly well. Something happened that made another type of species appear that had a little bit more cortical neurons. With that came more waking hours, which on top of facilitating getting enough energy to feed that larger brain and a larger body, it actually gives you more waking hours, which is, as Ayumu showed you, gives you opportunity to train your network and therefore improve your abilities. It comes at a cost that it will take you longer to develop and be able to reproduce, while other animals with fewer neurons are still are already reproducing and they're still doing fine, thank you, but in living at a faster pace. But still, this works. And if it keeps happening, eventually you get to the point where you develop your capabilities into so much ability that you can develop technology, get more neurons, and you give yourself problems that are complex enough that you can only solve them with technology, and technology becomes instrumental in actually affording you more time, for instance, to allow an even bigger increase in the number of neurons. Now remember, your brain is all the time taking longer and longer to develop, and it takes you to that point where you actually start overlapping more and more with those who came before you, and that's where you get to this one amazing thing that humans have that is rooted ultimately in biology, but that actually only develops if we have the time, the opportunity, and the means, which is cultural transmission. And that is where schooling comes in. Because it's thanks to schooling and to organized, systematized education that we no longer have to reinvent the wheel ourselves every new generation. The generations that came before us put it all together and give it over to us, hand it over to us. And that is how we keep a society that is made of individual brains, yes, but the society as a whole is so much more than that one individual human biology, all thanks to the time that we were awarded by these random things that happen in evolution that make it so that with more neurons comes more time awake, more free time as you solve your problems faster and faster and your cognitive capabilities improve, more time to learn, more time to teach, and more time to interact with one another. And that is one of the reasons why I appreciate so much having the opportunity to tell this story to whoever wants to listen. Thank you so much for your attention.